Psalms 46 through 48 are very similar. There's a lot in common between these three, so we're going to kind of, you might say, group them together in that way. All three psalms of praise to God for His greatness and for His provision, for His protection. And I think one important thing to always keep in mind as we're studying the Psalms is the time in which they were written. Approximately how many years before Christ were the Psalms written? Anybody remember? About 1,000, approximately. Of course, not every one of the Psalms was written by David. There are several different authors of the Psalms, but primarily David is the author, and he was about 1,000 years before Christ. So we need to keep that in mind. We need to keep in mind that since that is the case, we're dealing with a theocracy in Israel, a monarchy, but initially God's plan, you might say, was for the nation to always place their faith in Him. And, over time, as they digressed spiritually, they placed their faith, their confidence in their leaders. And, that's not always a good thing. So Psalm 46, the first three verses. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore will we not fear, though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, though the waters thereof roar and are troubled, though the mountains shake with the swelling thereof. Now, obviously, this is exaggeration for emphasis in these first three verses. Okay, the mountains being carried off into the midst of the sea. But when we think of what he's writing here and what he's going to continue to write, like I said, through all three of these Psalms that we're going to look at tonight, metaphorically, okay, figure of speech, in what ways might our mountains be moved into the sea and our waters be troubled in life? Okay, a flood, it might literally, you might have some earth-shaking events. Okay, life-changing events like death. All right. War. And certainly, and that's kind of what I was getting to with talking about Israel and what they were as a nation. War, the kings, Saul and David. Solomon was a kingdom of peace for his period of time because of what David and Saul did before. But throughout Saul and David's 40-year reigns each, there are wars. And certainly that would be... that would shake your world, as we say. One of the things that I wrote, I forget where I saw this, but I wrote next to verse 1 is, okay, so God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. I wrote out to the side of that, the anchor that holds. Whatever's going on in life, we have a safe place. And that's what a refuge is, obviously. Refuge is a place you run to in a time of trouble. You think of like perhaps a storm shelter, something like that. It's a place you go where you know you'll be safe. And He's our strength, that is, He's our source of strength. So that's what I'm getting at, metaphorically. God is our refuge and strength in the sense of there are going to be things in life that move our mountains, that feel like an overwhelming flood in life. So somebody turn over real quick and read Hebrews 6. Verses 19 and 20. Hebrews 6, verses 19 and 20. God is presented here, like I said, I wrote out to the side there, God is the anchor that holds. Well, Scripture actually tells us of an anchor. Hebrews 6, 19 and 20, somebody. We have a hope that holds, and we even sing that song, don't we? We have an anchor that keeps the soul what is it, steadfast and sure while the billows roll? I mean, that's what we're talking about. And so, I didn't turn over to Hebrews 6. My insulin pump was going off up here, so give me just a second to get there. So over here in Hebrews chapter 6, okay, you have the word hope there in verse 9, but you also have the word hope there, verse 19. You also have the word hope in verse 18, strong consolation, and all of this is in connection with what Christ has done. Throughout the book of Hebrews, but chapters 5, 6, 7, talking about the superiority of the priesthood of Christ, the superiority of His sacrifice and all of this, well, you notice there in verse 19. Read the end of verse 19 again for us, Forrest. Okay. Where Christ has gone. Where has Christ gone that's behind the veil? He's not literally behind a curtain somewhere. Where is He? He's in heaven. He's with His Father. That's the hope that holds us. That's the anchor that holds us in life. We know where Christ is. He's the forerunner. Well, a forerunner is somebody who goes before somebody else, which tells me, okay, He's there, I can get there. And so, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. No matter what life throws at us, we have a hope that abides. It's like Paul says in Romans 8, verse 24, hope saves us. All right, so I got a text the other day about should Christians be happy? Happy people. And yes, I think so, but are you always going to be happy in life? But can you always be hopeful? Can you always have hope in life and joy and peace? You can always have those things, but happiness may be elusive sometimes because of, like Timber said, maybe a death or maybe a sickness or whatever. You may have the peace of God. Okay, Philippians 4:6 talks about the peace of God that passes understanding. And you may have a hope of heaven, but you're not happy, are you? So we need to be careful that we don't conflate those concepts of what the world thinks of happiness, that the Bible doesn't always present it that way, and that life is not always the way we think it should be, maybe. Any questions or thoughts on that? Mm. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, God. Yeah, in the days of the flood, he could certainly be using a historical event to make a point in the present, and that's what we're trying to do. You know, that's the thing about Bible study is, you know, the book of Psalms was not written to us. You've heard me say this. The Bible was not written to us. The book of Ephesians was not written to us, for instance. Corinthians was not written to us. Those letters were written to congregations in the first century about things that they were going through. But we have to go through there and be able to properly interpret those passages and make application to ourselves. And it's no different with the Old Testament. God is still our refuge and strength, and He's still a present help in time of trouble. So, any other thoughts or comments on that? There's a river, verse 4, the streams whereof shall make glad the city of God. Now, the city of God, and again, we see this throughout the Psalms, a reference to Zion, a reference to Jerusalem. That is, of course, the center of Jewish life, you might say. This is the center of worship, the temples there and all of that. Well, I don't think he's literally describing the city of Jerusalem here, but the language, it's like a word picture that he's painting here. The holy place of the tabernacle of the Most High, tabernacles of the Most High, God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God shall help her. And that right early. I think the New King James says, at the break of dawn. You know, the point being, God is always there, regardless of what's going on. And now it's interesting. Let's do this. Turn over to Ezekiel chapter 10. This is a little excursion we're going to take. I hadn't planned on this, but I was thinking about it as I was saying what I was just saying, God always being in the midst of her, the source of strength. Ezekiel's about 500 years later, after David, and Ezekiel is one of the captives. Okay, he's been taken into Babylonian captivity. The nation of Judah, city of Jerusalem, it's been wiped out. And primarily because of their idolatry, they're breaking the covenant and all of this. So Ezekiel's sitting by a river in Babylon, and he sees this vision in chapter 1, which is the throne of God, the cherubim. He sees all of this, and it's a source of comfort. God's not stuck in Jerusalem. He's not limited to the physical structure in the city of Jerusalem, which the Babylonians destroyed, by the way. But here in Ezekiel chapter 10, Ezekiel sees this imagery that he saw in chapter 1, this throne, the cherubim, and all of this. But what he sees is, look at somebody read Ezekiel 10 and verse 18.
Then the glory of the Lord departed from off the threshold of the house and stood over the cherubims.
Do you remember when, this is basically the last half of the book of Exodus, God, from Exodus 25 to 40, instructs Israel to build the tabernacle. The tabernacle was the movable tent that they could take with them throughout the wilderness. It was the precursor to the temple that would be built in Jerusalem. What happened to the tabernacle when it was all built and all the furnishings were in it? What happened in that moment? Do you remember? At the very end of Exodus. I'll give you a hint. It's the opposite of what just happened here. His glory filled the temple, or the tabernacle. I'm with you. I'm here. Throughout the wanderings, I'll be with you. 500 years, well, actually, with dating from the time of Moses, about 1,000 years later, 500 years after the Psalms, Israel has turned from God so far that His glory departs Jerusalem. It leaves the temple. And it's indicative of the sin of the people. You think how many years He's warned them through his prophets, through His priests, and all of these different people. And in Ezekiel's day, they're carried off into captivity because they refuse to repent. Well, sir?
What river is he speaking of?
In the Psalms? I think it's just, I don't think it's a particular river. I think it's just a word picture of the presence of God in their lives. That's the way I've taken it. Because there are some tributaries that run through that region, but there's not a river that runs through little Jerusalem. Yeah, it was 20 miles to the east. Yeah. I think it's just a word picture. The idea, so here's a question to think about. What does a river provide? Civilizations or people that go places, a lot of times would build along rivers, because what does a river provide for you? Okay, drinkable water, source of food, transportation, freight, trade, yeah, all kinds of stuff. Well, what does God provide for you? Everything. And I think that's the concept here in Psalm chapter 46. Back to verse 5. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God shall help her. And that right early. And that's what I was saying. So 1000 BC, that's where we are. 500 BC, God's glory departs. And He's like, I've had enough. You're going to captivity. The heathen raged, verse 6. The kingdoms were moved. He uttered, God, His voice, and the earth melted. When God spoke from Sinai, it's recorded in Exodus 19, everybody was afraid. And even Moses was afraid, wasn't he? And it's recorded for us also in Hebrews chapter 12, that event. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. So it continues on there, praising Him. Verse 11, a repetition. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. So, again, poetic, and that's the book of Psalms is a book of poetry, but this language is descriptive of the presence of God, the comfort that God provides. It's like in 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 3. He is the God of all comfort. And I may not be in a very pleasant place in life, but God's the God of all comfort and the God of mercy. And I can rejoice and be glad for that, even though I may not be going through the greatest time I've ever had in life. That's comforting to me. I think that's part of this idea in Philippians 4 of the peace that passes understanding. Because in what ways, think about it. Think about people you've known and things you've seen people do. In what ways do people seek joy and happiness in life if God is no part of their life? It might be just their immediate family. What else? What else do people turn to? Their wealth, okay. Okay, nature, yeah. If things are going bad, what do people turn to? Maybe alcohol, maybe drugs, things to what they would think would take their mind off of their current circumstance. And there is no abiding peace. And I think that's the point that we need to remember. For the Christian, there is an abiding peace. There is that anchor. There is the one who's entered in behind the veil. He's the forerunner for us, and He doesn't move. He's steadfast, even though our world could be turned upside down, as we say. Anything else before we move on here? No. He wrote, I forget the number. I'm wanting to say like 89 of them are historically attributed to him. There are several different authors that are historically credited. Moses wrote at least Psalm 90. Solomon wrote one or two, I believe. There's several different writers. I've got a chart somewhere in my notes that shows the different authors. All right, chapter 47. And this is strictly a psalm of praise. And really, Psalm 46 is a psalm of praise, but just a couple of different things I want to notice here. Notice Psalm 47. Somebody read verses 1 and 2. Okay. Why do you clap your hands? Typically it's in celebration or praise or something like that, isn't it? Well, that's what God is, that's what the people of the lands are called to do here. And that's interesting to me because in Judaism, many of the Jews came to think of God as their God. He was theirs. He lived in Jerusalem in the temple. And this psalm says, all ye lands, praise God, basically. Clap your hands. Verse 2 there is interesting. I think Don is reading from the New King James. For the Lord Most High is awesome. King James, what does it say? Terrible. Okay, that's a bit odd. We think of terrible today, and what do we think of? It says that was terrible. I mean, that's not good. Well, terrible is the idea of being. God is to be feared. He's to be reverenced. Yeah. Awful is how we use terrible today. Well, God is not awful. He is awesome. A-W-E, awe, to be respected, to be reverenced. He is the great king over all the earth. Now, that's an interesting thought because we're not getting as far as I thought we would. Ephesians chapter 2. Just think about this for just a minute. Ephesians 2, verses 1 through 3. Paul talks about the Ephesians in their pre-Christian state. And he said that they walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air. All right? 2 Corinthians 4:4, Paul says that there are some who are blinded by the god of this world. And yet, we're told that God is the God over all the earth here. So how do you reconcile those concepts? Any thoughts? That's what I'm asking. The New Testament says that the God of this world blinds people, and it's a reference to Satan, but the Old Testament says God's God over all the earth. So is that a contradiction? And you can't just say no. That's not an answer. Because you say that to some people, and they'll say, well, yeah, it is. Tell me why it's not. Is it a contradiction? God is the God over all the earth, but Satan is the God of this world. In fact, Jesus, before His crucifixion, it's in John chapter 16, He says, the God of this world is judged. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So one of you two, I don't care who it is, turn over to 1 John 5 and read, I think it's verse 19. So God is God over all. God is, the word sometimes used is sovereign. God is over all. But this world is the realm of Satan's influence. It doesn't mean that Satan is over all. And it's what 4 said. He may be powerful, but he's not all powerful. It's like when God addressed Abraham in Genesis 17. He said, I am God Almighty. Satan's not almighty. Yeah. Yes. And that's what, who's got 1 John 5:19?
And we know that we are of God, and the whole world lies in wickedness.
There you go. The whole world lies in wickedness. And it's the New King James does a bit better there. It says the whole world lies under the sway of the wicked one. That doesn't mean that he's in control of everything. And a way, so think of the book of Job, okay, when God presented, Satan didn't know about Job. That's the way I take it. Because Satan is giving an account to God, and God says, where have you been? And he says, well, I've been on the earth walking to and fro. And then what does God say? Have you considered my servant? To me, the way I read that, Satan didn't know. There's no man like him on earth. So why haven't you gone after him, essentially? And so not only is Satan's knowledge limited, but his power is limited, because Satan says, well, the only reason he serves you is because you put a hedge about him, you've made him rich. And God said, okay, take it. You can't touch him, but you can take everything he's got. So Satan is limited in knowledge and in power. And that's kind of the point I'm making. Yes, God is over all the earth, and Satan is the God of this world. He's the influence. This is his realm of influence, you might say. And so there is no contradiction here. It's understanding God as who He is and Satan as who he is. And there's an interesting thing, I think sometimes, is that I think humans attribute too much power to Satan. Like he is way more powerful than we are. And I heard one guy describe it as like God's up here and Satan's just below him and we're just way down here. And that is false. That is not true. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. James chapter 4 and verse 7. Resist him steadfast in the faith. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 9. 1 Peter 5:8 says he's a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. But then verse 9 says, resist him. Which tells me that my will is more powerful than his will. He cannot overtake me. He can't make me do anything. This is his realm of influence, yes. But he's not as powerful as I am. And he's certainly not even close to God. So I think we need to be careful as to how much we attribute to Satan. Here's my question. How did I get off on that subject? I think we were talking back to Psalm 47. verse 2, we were talking about God, awesome, terrible, and I went off on that tangent. Any questions or comments on all of that stuff? Yes. I was doing my daily Bible reading this afternoon from John. My reading today was John 17 through 21. And from really back to John chapter 12, Jesus repeatedly says, I am leaving this world. My disciples are not of this world. The God of this world is being judged. And that word is always cosmos. But sometimes, okay, so He's leaving this world. We know what that means, don't we? Jesus was here, and He left here and went to heaven. But then you have the phrase, like in 1 John 2:15, do not love the world. Well, He's not talking about like the physical, material planet. So, yes, the word world is used differently. And there are actually two different Greek words that are translated as world. One is cosmos, which can mean a variety of things. And maybe there in 2 Corinthians 4:4, He's the God of this world. Perhaps that's the idea of the God of the power of influence in this realm. But sometimes there's another word, not cosmos, but it's gay. And that always means the planet, okay, the ball on which we live. And so context will tell you what it means. Mm. Yeah. 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 Mm. Yeah, I don't know about the Hebrew term there, Joe. Let me pull up my Bible app here and see what I can find out. Psalm 40, what are we? Psalm 47, verse 2. Anyway, words, you can have technical definitions, and I've told you this before, and you should know this. Words can have technical definitions, which means that's what the dictionary says it means, but then the context can change the meaning of the term, and you have to allow the context to do that. Okay, so this says the Hebrew word means the land, the region. And so that would make sense. He's the God over all this creation. And He is. But yeah, it's talking about the ground, the surface of the earth, even down to soil. So that's kind of interesting, isn't it? Anybody else? Okay, we're still in Psalm 47. Not a lot to add to this. Verse 6, sing praises to God, sing praises unto the King, unto our King, sing praises. It's just a repetition all the way down through verse 9. He's called the God of Abraham in verse 9. Jesus, the Sadducees came to Jesus with that story of this woman who had married a man, and they didn't have kids. He died. She married his brother. No kids. He died. And he goes through 7 of them. And, well, in the resurrection, whose wife shall she be, since they all 7 had her? And what did he say about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? God is not the God of the what? He's not the God of the dead, but of the living. He is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which means in the day Jesus was speaking, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were alive. They didn't cease to be once they died. And there's a resurrection in the future. So here, I don't know exactly how many years after Abraham, but He's still the God of Abraham, isn't He? And that's the same God we serve. Let's look at one more verse. Look at one verse in Psalm 48, and then we'll say we got through all 3 chapters because they're so similar. Look at Psalm 48 and verse 9. Somebody read that, please. Okay. The midst of thy temple. Well, David didn't build the temple, did he? Who built the temple? Solomon. David got everything prepared and such, but he was forbidden from building the temple. Solomon did, but in the midst of the temple. Well, again, I think metaphorically, because this is 1,000 years before Christ. How can we apply this to us? Well, we have thought of thy loving kindness, O God, in the midst of the congregation, in the midst of the church. You know, this is a place, I think when we assemble together, we ought to be happy to be here and glad to see each other. But what is our primary purpose of being here? We're here to worship. And yes, we get out of worship too. We stir up and provoke one another to love and good works. We do that via the assembly, our times together, our fellowship together. But primarily, our purpose here is to worship God. And I thought about that in verse 9. In our worship and service to God, we sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, don't we? We teach and admonish one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, Colossians 3:16. If you come to worship and you think it's just about me and him, you've got half of it right. But it's also about me and you. And so we're praising God, we're encouraging and uplifting one another, and that's, again, thinking about some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, the things that people in the world turn to who have no relationship with God, who don't have a church family. They have a totally different outlook on life, don't they? But the sad thing is, sometimes people within these walls have the same outlook that those in the world have. And verses like Psalm 48:9 should serve as a reminder. 48:14, for this God is our God forever and ever. He will be our guide even unto death. It's not any different today, is it? He's our God and He should guide us unto death. Absolutely. Any questions or comments on any of that stuff? Mm. Well, this is one of those questions like I used to go into a business, and in this business, the owner had on the wall painted Jeremiah 29:11. I know the plans that I have for you, plans of prosperity. And that verse is about Babylonian captivity. Okay? And I think verses like this are treated that way. But in my opinion, in the totality of Psalm 46, if we're going to look at it the way we are looking at it, yeah, think about how much stuff pulls for your attention on a daily basis. You know, work, kids, all of your, let's say, domestic responsibilities, your civic responsibilities, all that stuff's pulling at you. And like avenues of communication, telephones, text messages, email, instant messenger, all of this stuff is constantly, those things are, I cannot tell you how many messages I get every day. It's like some days before I put the phone down, I'm getting another message. That will work you over, won't it? That will wear you down. And sometimes the best thing to do is just shut everything off and be still. Be quiet. Sit back and just go out in the woods and climb a tree. Do something. Life will keep you busy, but I think there are moments. So, I guess to answer your question, yes. It means what it says. Be still and know that I am God. So many things are pulling at you. Sometimes you just need to get away from it all and be still. Be quiet. Mm. Absolutely. And it may not be anything, it could be physical, it could be mental, it could be emotional, all kinds of things could be working you over. And I think Psalm 46:10 is a good one to keep in mind. Be still. and know that I am God. Know that I. So, okay, back up to what verse was it? He's the God over all the earth. Verse 47, verse 2. We need to be still and remember that sometimes. All right, guys. Appreciate your attention.